It all started, as these things often do, with a gate. Not just any gate, mind you. My gate. The gate to Serenity Acres, my little slice of heaven carved out of the rolling hills just beyond where the city decided to spill its guts and call it suburbia. For years, that gate, a sturdy, unpretentious affair of weathered oak and black iron, had been the silent guardian of my peace, the clear demarcation between my world of dusty trails, contented livestock, and the blessed quiet of the countryside, and their world. Their world was the preserve at Whispering Pines, a relatively new development of beige houses, meticulously manicured lawns the size of postage stamps, and an HOA that seemed to have an opinion on everything from the precise shade of your welcome mat to the existential angst of your garden gnomes. My ranch, Serenity Acres, predated the preserve by a good 50 years. My grandfather had built the main house, sunk the posts for that very gate, and instilled in me a healthy respect for property lines and a distinct lack of patience for folks who felt entitled to tell you how to live on your own land. I'd inherited the ranch, and with it, a fierce desire to keep it as it always had been, a sanctuary. The gate wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. It kept my horses from wandering where they shouldn't and, more importantly these days, kept the overly curious and occasionally lost residents of the preserve from using my long driveway as a scenic shortcut or, heaven forbid, a dog-walking trail. Now, I wasn't entirely disconnected from the world of property management and its attendant headaches. As a way to diversify and secure my future beyond the whims of weather and livestock prices, I'd invested in a few rental properties over the years, mostly single-family homes in quieter, established neighborhoods further into town. These were managed by a competent, if somewhat impersonal, company called Starkweather Property Management. I preferred it that way. They handled the leases, the repairs, the tenant screenings. I got a check, they got a percentage, and I rarely had to involve myself in the day-to-day dramas of leaky faucets or squabbling neighbors. My name was on the deeds, of course, usually under a holding company for liability reasons, but Starkweather was the public face. It was a neat, tidy arrangement that allowed me to focus on Serenity Acres. Little did I know that this anodyne side hustle was about to intersect with my tranquil ranch life in the most spectacularly irritating way possible, all thanks to one Eleanor Albright, the self-appointed queen of the preserve's HOA. I'd seen her around, of course. A woman of a certain age, with a helmet of perfectly lacquered hair that seemed impervious to wind, and a gaze that could curdle milk at 20 paces. She always seemed to be marching somewhere with a clipboard, a look of profound disapproval etched onto her face. Our paths hadn't directly crossed, thankfully. I kept to my side of the fence, metaphorically and literally, and assumed the residents of the preserve were content to do the same, aside from the occasional stray golf ball or an escaped poodle. That assumption, like many peaceful assumptions in life, was about to be shattered. The opening salvo in what would become the War of the Gate was far more innocuous than the eventual fireworks, but it carried the distinct whiff of future trouble, like the smell of ozone before a thunderstorm. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp and clear. I was out near the gate, checking the latch mechanism which had been a bit sticky. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and horses. That's when her car, a pristine white SUV that screamed, suburban command vehicle, glided to a halt on the asphalt road that ran past my property line. Eleanor Albright emerged, clipboard already in hand, as if it were an extension of her arm. She didn't approach my gate directly, but stood on the edge of the preserve's manicured sidewalk, peering at my gate with an expression usually reserved for finding a slug in one's salad. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning calm. I straightened up, wiping grease from my hands onto an old rag. I wasn't technically in the preserve, my ranch merely bordered it, a fact that had, up until now, been a source of quiet satisfaction. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She took a few steps closer, her heels clicking on the pavement, a stark contrast to the soft thud of my work boots on my own gravel driveway. "That gate," she began, without any preamble or polite inquiry. "It's really not in keeping with the community aesthetic, is it?" I blinked. My gate. My 50-year-old, perfectly functional, historically appropriate ranch gate. Community aesthetic? I echoed, a brow starting to arch. "This is Serenity Acres. It's a working ranch." "The gate is part of it," she sniffed, a small, disdainful sound. "Well, the preserve at Whispering Pines prides itself on a certain standard. And that structure," she gestured vaguely towards my gate with her pen, "is rather an eyesore. It's old. The wood is rustic. The way she said rustic made it sound like a communicable disease. I could feel a slow burn starting in my chest. This was my land, my gate. Who was she to dictate aesthetics to me from across a property line I paid taxes on? I took a deliberate breath, reminding myself that losing my temper with a woman who clearly derived nourishment from confrontation was unlikely to be productive. "Well, Mrs. Albright," I said, my voice carefully even, "I appreciate your perspective. However, this gate is on my private property, and it serves its purpose perfectly. It's also, as you pointed out, rather old, much like the ranch itself, which was here long before the preserve. So, it's staying." I gave her what I hoped was a polite but firm smile. Her lips thinned. "The HOA has certain covenants regarding visual harmony," she pressed on, completely ignoring my point. "And while your property may not be directly under our purview for dues, its proximity impacts the overall desirability and property values of the preserve." This was rich. My well-maintained, historic ranch was somehow a detriment. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I thought about my rental properties, about the tenants who paid their rent on time and mostly kept to themselves, managed efficiently by Starkweather. That was how neighborly interactions should work, with clear boundaries and mutual respect, or at least, benign indifference. This felt like the opposite. This felt like an invasion. "Mrs. Albright," I said, my patience beginning to fray at the edges, "my gate is not changing. It's safe, it's secure, and frankly, its appearance is my business and no one else's. Have a good day." I turned back to the latch, a clear dismissal. I heard another sniff, followed by the click of her heels retreating, and then the smooth purr of her SUV driving away. I let out a long breath. Just a busybody, I told myself. A first skirmish, nothing more. But a small, nagging part of me knew this wasn't over. People like Eleanor Albright didn't just give up. They dug in. And my gate, my beautiful, steadfast gate, had just become a target. The peace of Serenity Acres felt a little less serene that morning. The following week, the first official-looking envelope arrived. It wasn't addressed to Serenity Acres, but to the occupant, my ranch address, and bore the grand insignia of the Preserve at Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. My stomach gave a little lurch. So, she wasn't just going to let it go. Inside, on thick, creamy paper that probably cost more than a bag of feed, was a politely worded but unmistakable demand: notice of noncompliance, boundary structure aesthetics. It cited a non-existent clause, something about harmonious visual continuity with adjacent community standards, and requested I rectify the situation regarding my gate within 14 days. Rectify. As if my gate were a broken sewer pipe. It went on to suggest I consider a modern, approved-style vinyl or powder-coated aluminum gate, perhaps in a tasteful beige or forest green, to better complement the preserve's sophisticated entryway. I snorted. Vinyl. On a 50-year-old ranch. The sheer, unadulterated gall. I could almost hear my grandfather spinning in his grave. My initial annoyance began to curdle into a more resolute anger. This wasn't just about a gate anymore, it was about principle. It was about a woman with a power trip trying to impose her will where she had absolutely no jurisdiction. I spent a good hour that evening with a tumbler of bourbon and my property deeds spread out on the old oak dining table. The language was clear. My property line was inviolate. There were no shared easements, no covenants that tied Serenity Acres to the preserve's increasingly bizarre aesthetic demands. My land was mine, free and clear, predating their entire beige existence. The HOA had precisely zero authority over my gate, my fences, my choice of rooster, or the color of my damn barn. The next morning, I typed up a brief, polite, but very firm response. I cited the relevant sections of my deed, highlighted the lack of any legal standing for their notice, and stated unequivocally that no changes would be made to my gate. I even included a photocopy of the pertinent page from my property survey, with the boundary line clearly marked. I mailed it back to the HOA, registered mail, return receipt requested. Let them chew on that. I also made a mental note to check in with Starkweather Property Management. Not about this specifically, but just a general checkup on my rentals. One of them, a neat little bungalow on Primrose Path, had a lease renewal coming up in a few months. The tenants, a quiet couple named Albright, had been there for about 2 years. Mr. Albright worked from home, something in IT, and Mrs. Albright. Well, the property manager's notes were usually sparse on spousal occupations unless it was relevant to income. Generally good tenants, rent always on time, was the last note. No red flags. The name Albright tickled at the back of my mind, but it was a common enough name. Surely not, no, it couldn't be. The thought was dismissed as quickly as it came. That kind of coincidence only happened in bad novels. For a few blissful days, there was silence. I almost allowed myself to believe my letter had done the trick. Perhaps Eleanor Albright, faced with incontrovertible legal facts, had decided to retreat and find some other poor soul to torment over the height of their bird bath. Then, the second envelope arrived. This one was sterner. It acknowledged my letter but stated the Aesthetic Review Committee, which I suspected consisted entirely of Eleanor Albright and perhaps a very frightened poodle, had reviewed my appeal, and found it lacking in merit. My property deed. It went on to inform me that if I failed to comply, fines would be levied. Fines. For a gate on my own land, over which they had no authority. The letter was signed by Eleanor Albright, President, HOA. President. Of course she was. It explained the messianic zeal. This was no longer just annoying, it was harassment. I started a new file, labeled HOA Nuisance, and placed her letters, copies of my replies, and the registered mail receipt inside. Documentation, my lawyer friend always said, is your best friend in a fight. I even took some photos of my gate, from various angles, just in case. And then, her tactics shifted from paper to passive aggression. I'd find small, annoying things. A pile of grass clippings mysteriously blown onto my driveway, right in front of the gate. An empty soda can left perched on one of my fence posts. Minor things, deniable things, but the timing and location were too coincidental. I started seeing her more often, too. Her white SUV would cruise slowly past my property line, and I'd catch her peering through the trees, sometimes even with binoculars. Once, I saw her quickly lower a phone as if she'd been taking pictures. The sheer audacity was escalating. It was like being stalked by a particularly persnickety badger. My peaceful mornings were now tinged with a sense of vigilance. I found myself glancing towards the road more often, a knot of irritation tightening in my stomach whenever that white SUV hove into view. The joy of simply mending a fence or checking on the horses was being eroded by this constant, petty intrusion. My neighbors on the other sides, old farming families like my own, would occasionally ask if that HOA woman was bothering me. Apparently, I wasn't her only target, though I seemed to be her current fixation. One of them, old Jedediah, who'd known my grandfather, just cackled. "Give her hell, son," he'd said. Some folks just need to be reminded where their property ends and common sense begins. I was beginning to think Jedediah was right. Common sense seemed to be in very short supply over at the preserve at Whispering Pines, particularly in its presidential suite. The thought of my rental income, quietly accumulating via Starkweather, was a small comfort, a reminder of a part of my life that was orderly and drama-free. If only all interactions could be so straightforward. But Eleanor Albright, it was becoming clear, was anything but straightforward. She was a tangled mess of misplaced authority and unyielding entitlement. The paper warfare continued for another week or so. I received a second notice of noncompliance, this time with a printed fine schedule attached. It listed escalating penalties for failure to rectify aesthetic deficiencies, starting at $50 and rapidly climbing into the hundreds. It was so ludicrous it was almost funny, if it hadn't been so infuriatingly persistent. I continued to send polite, firm refusals, reiterating my property rights and the HOA's complete lack of jurisdiction. I was building quite a collection of certified mail receipts. I also started a log of her drive-bys and photographic expeditions. It felt silly, like something out of a spy movie, but I had a growing feeling this might escalate beyond sternly worded letters. Eleanor Albright struck me as someone who did not take kindly to being ignored or, worse, defied. Her entire persona seemed built on the expectation of immediate compliance. The fact that I, a mere rancher with a rustic gait, was refusing to bow to her decrees must have been galling. I could almost picture her, sitting in her beige house, surrounded by her beige furniture, stewing in her beige rage. The pressure was definitely mounting. Not legally, of course, I knew I was on solid ground there. But emotionally. It's draining to be constantly under siege, even by a foe armed only with a clipboard and a surfeit of self-importance. My gate, once a symbol of simple utility, had become a battleground. Every time I passed through it, I felt a fresh wave of resentment towards Mrs. Albright and her relentless campaign. I began to understand how people could get drawn into protracted, bitter disputes over seemingly minor things. It wasn't about the gate anymore, not really. It was about her trying to exert power she didn't possess, and my refusal to let her. One particularly lovely Saturday morning, I decided I'd had enough of her peering. I was planning to repaint a section of fence that ran parallel to the road, not far from the infamous gate. It was a perfect day for it, sunny, with a light breeze. As I was setting up my paint cans and brushes, I saw the white SUV make its customary slow pass. This time, however, it stopped. Eleanor Albright got out, phone in hand, and began ostentatiously photographing my fence, then my gate, then me. She was actually on the public sidewalk, so not technically trespassing, but it was clear harassment. "Do you mind?" I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. She lowered her phone, a smug little smile playing on her lips. "Just documenting the ongoing violations for the HOA records, Mr. Henderson," she said, using my name for the first time. So, she'd bothered to look me up. "There are no violations, Mrs. Albright, as you well know," I retorted, trying to keep my temper in check. "This is private property, and this," she gestured to the sidewalk, "is public. I am well within my rights to observe and document anything visible from a public thoroughfare, especially when it negatively impacts our community." The sheer, unmitigated nerve of this woman. She was deliberately provoking me. I could feel the anger, a hot, tight knot in my chest, threatening to boil over. I thought of all the notices, the drive-bys, the feeling of my sanctuary being violated by her prying eyes and petty rules. "You know, Mrs. Albright," I said, taking a slow step towards the gate, "there's a word for people who obsessively watch others without their consent. Several, in fact. None of them are flattering." Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of outrage. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Henderson?" "I'm stating a fact, Mrs. Albright. You are harassing me. And frankly, I'm tired of it." I reached the gate. She was standing just a few feet away on the other side, her expression hardening. "This gate is an affront," she declared, her voice rising. "It's a dilapidated eyesore, and you are a stubborn, uncooperative individual who refuses to see reason." That was it. The culmination of weeks of her nonsense, her entitlement, her sheer, bloody-minded refusal to respect a simple boundary. My hand was on the gate. With a sudden, decisive movement, I pulled it shut. The old oak and iron moved smoothly, and with a satisfying, resonant clang, the latch engaged. Right in her astonished, sputtering face. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Eleanor Albright stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape, her perfectly coiffed hair seeming to quiver with indignation. The smugness had vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. Then, her face turned a rather alarming shade of puce. "How dare you?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You can't do that. Open this gate. Open it right now." I leaned against my side of the gate, arms crossed, and regarded her calmly. "Actually, Mrs. Albright, I can. It's my gate. On my property." "And you were becoming rather loud and offensive." Her eyes, wide and furious, darted from me to the gate and back again. "This is an outrage. An absolute outrage. I am the president of the Homeowners Association. You will show me respect. Respect is earned, Mrs. Albright, not demanded. And certainly not by behaving like a common bully." The color in her face deepened. "If looks could kill, I'd have been a smoldering pile of ashes." She balled her hands into fists. "You haven't heard the last of this, Mr. Henderson. Oh no. I am going to make you regret this. I am going to ensure you are fined into oblivion. I am going to." She trailed off, sputtering, apparently lost for words adequate to convey the depth of her fury. Then, a new, determined glint appeared in her eye. She whipped out her phone again, jabbing at the screen with a trembling finger. "That's it. I'm calling the police. You assaulted me. You imprisoned me from viewing your dilapidated structure." Assaulted her? By closing my own gate? The absurdity was reaching new heights. "Be my guest, Mrs. Albright," I said, my voice still even. "I'm sure they'll be fascinated to hear your version of events." "I'll just be here, on my property, minding my own business," she glared at me, then turned her back, phone pressed to her ear, and began speaking in a loud, agitated voice, clearly designed for me to overhear. "Yes, officer. I need assistance immediately. I'm at the boundary of the preserve at Whispering Pines. Yes, a Mr. Henderson. He's been threatening, and he slammed a gate in my face. He's being incredibly hostile. I feel unsafe." I sighed and shook my head. Unsafe? Because a man closed his own gate. The drama. I could almost admire her commitment to theatricality if it wasn't so damn irritating. I stayed where I was, leaning against the gate, watching her performance. She paced back and forth on the sidewalk, gesturing wildly as she spoke into the phone, occasionally shooting venomous looks in my direction. I wondered what the dispatcher on the other end was making of it all. Probably categorizing it under neighborhood dispute, low priority, high annoyance factor. After a few more minutes of increasingly agitated monologue, she hung up, a look of grim triumph on her face. "They're on their way," she announced, as if she'd just summoned a tactical strike team. "And then we'll see who's right and who's wrong, Mr. Henderson." "Indeed we will, Mrs. Albright," I replied. I wasn't particularly worried. I hadn't broken any laws. I hadn't threatened her, despite her accusations. I had simply exercised my right to close my gate on my property. If anything, her continued presence and her histrionics were bordering on harassment of me. I decided to use the waiting time productively. I walked back to where I'd left my painting supplies, picked up a brush, and calmly began applying a fresh coat of white paint to the section of fence I'd intended to work on. It was a good, solid fence, much like the gate. Built to last. Built to withstand the elements, and, apparently, the fury of overzealous HOA presidents. The rhythmic motion of the brush was soothing. Behind me, I could hear Mrs. Albright muttering to herself, punctuated by impatient sighs. Let her stew. The sun was warm on my back, the birds were singing, and for a moment, despite the impending arrival of law enforcement, Serenity Acres lived up to its name. I was actually starting to feel a perverse sense of amusement. This whole situation was rapidly escalating into the realm of the truly bizarre. All because of a gate. A perfectly good, entirely legal gate. It took about 15 minutes for the patrol car to arrive. It pulled up quietly, and 2 officers got out. One was older, with a look of weary patience etched on his face, the kind that suggested he'd seen every flavor of human folly the county had to offer. The other was younger, more observant, his expression neutral. Mrs. Albright practically pounced on them before they'd even fully closed their car doors. "Officers. Thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, her voice laden with manufactured distress. "This man," she pointed dramatically at me, where I was still calmly painting my fence, "has been incredibly aggressive and hostile. He slammed his gate in my face when I was simply trying to discuss a community standards violation. He's a menace." The older officer, whose name tag read Miller, held up a hand. "All right, ma'am, slow down. Let's get your side of the story first. What exactly happened?" Mrs. Albright launched into her tale, a masterpiece of exaggeration and misdirection. She painted herself as the calm, reasonable representative of community order, merely trying to uphold the aesthetic integrity of the preserve. I was portrayed as a belligerent recluse, deliberately flouting rules, which didn't apply to me, and culminating in the assault of the gate-slamming incident. She conveniently omitted the weeks of harassment, the baseless notices, the photographing, and the fact that she was the one who had initiated the confrontation that morning. I continued painting, letting her spin her narrative. There was no point interrupting. Her version was so far removed from reality that it would discredit itself. Officer Miller listened patiently, occasionally jotting something in his notebook. The younger officer, Ramirez, stood slightly behind him, his gaze moving between Mrs. Albright, the gate, and me. When she finally wound down, breathless and flushed with self-righteous indignation, Officer Miller turned towards me. "All right, sir," he said, his voice calm and professional. "Now, can we get your side of this?" I put down my paintbrush, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked over to the gate, staying on my side of it. "Good morning, officers," I said. "Name's Tom Henderson." This is my property, Serenity Acres. I gave them a brief, factual account of the morning's events, starting with Mrs. Albright stopping to photograph me and my property without consent, her aggressive accusations about my gate, and my eventual decision to close the gate when she became verbally abusive. I then broadened the context, explaining the weeks of unsolicited notices from the HOA, the threats of fines for a gate over which they had no jurisdiction, and her repeated drive-bys and attempts to photograph my property. Frankly, officers, I concluded, I've been feeling harassed by Mrs. Albright for some time now. Closing my gate was simply an attempt to end an unpleasant confrontation on my own property. Throughout my explanation, Mrs. Albright kept trying to interject. That's a lie. He was threatening. He was uncooperative. Officer Miller would politely ask her to wait her turn. He looked at my gate, then at the fence I was painting, then back at me. There was nothing threatening about the scene. Just a man doing chores on his own ranch. So, to be clear, Mr. Henderson, Officer Miller said, you closed your gate on your property because you felt the conversation was becoming hostile. That's correct, officer, I affirmed. She was yelling, making accusations. I simply ended the interaction by securing my property line. Officer Ramirez spoke up for the first time. Ma'am, he said to Mrs. Albright, did Mr. Henderson physically touch you or threaten you with physical harm? Mrs. Albright hesitated. The gate slamming was dramatic, but it wasn't a physical assault on her person. Well, no, not touch me, but the way he slammed that heavy gate. It was very aggressive. It was menacing. I felt threatened. Officer Miller sighed, a very subtle sound. Ma'am, Mr. Henderson has the right to open or close the gate on his own property. Unless he made a direct threat to you, or physically assaulted you, him closing his gate isn't a police matter but the violations. The community standards, she sputtered, her argument deflating. That gate is an eyesore. It affects our property values. It was at this point that she said the words that would unknowingly change the entire dynamic, words that made a very specific, previously dismissed connection click firmly into place in my mind. I live at 123 Primrose Path, she declared, puffing herself up as if her address lent her argument more weight. A respectable part of this community, and we expect certain standards to be maintained, even by those adjacent to us. 123 Primrose Path. The address was suddenly illuminated in my mind as if by a spotlight. Primrose Path. Albright. Lease renewal coming up. Managed by Starkweather Property Management. Oh. My. God. The realization hit me with the force of a stray X. Eleanor Albright, the HOA president from hell, the tormentor of my gate, the architect of my current Saturday morning disruption, was my tenant. A slow smile, one I couldn't quite contain, began to spread across my face. The pieces clicked together with a satisfying mental thunk. Eleanor Albright of 123 Primrose Path, whose lease was indeed managed by Starkweather Properties, was standing right there, having called the police on her own landlord. The sheer, exquisite irony of it was almost too much to bear. Both officers noticed my change in demeanor. Officer Miller raised an eyebrow. Something amusing, Mr. Henderson. Mrs. Albright, oblivious, was still fuming. It's not amusing. It's a serious matter of community integrity. Actually, officers, I said, my voice rich with a newfound calm, a calm that bordered on smugness, I admit. This situation has just become a little circular. Mrs. Albright is quite right, 123 Primrose Path is a respectable address. In fact, I know it rather well. I paused for effect. Eleanor Albright looked at me, a flicker of confusion warring with her indignation. What are you talking about? She demanded. I turned to the officers, but made sure she could hear me clearly. You see, officers, the property at 123 Primrose Path, where Mrs. Albright resides. I own it. She's my tenant. Her lease is managed through Starkweather Property Management, but the ultimate landlord, well, that's me. There was a moment of profound silence. Officer Miller's eyebrows shot up. Officer Ramirez actually blinked, a small, almost imperceptible crack in his professional composure. But the reaction from Eleanor Albright was everything I could have hoped for, and more. Her jaw, which had been set in a belligerent line, literally dropped. The color, which had been a furious puce, drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly much older. Her eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in dawning horror. What? No. That's impossible, she stammered, her voice a mere squeak compared to its earlier stridente. You're lying. I assure you, Mrs. Albright, I'm not, I said, my voice gentle but firm. Starkweather handles the day-to-day, which is probably why we haven't formally met in this capacity. But the name on the deed for 123 Primrose Path will trace back to a holding company, and that holding company is mine. You've been, by all accounts from Mr. Starkweather, a reasonably adequate tenant up until now, though I believe your lease is up for review in a couple of months. The words lease up for review hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The transformation in Eleanor Albright was astonishing. The bluster, the arrogance, the self-righteous fury, it all just evaporated. She looked like a punctured balloon. Her shoulders slumped. The clipboard, her symbol of authority, slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the sidewalk. She stared at me, then at the officers, then back at me, her expression a comical mixture of terror and utter mortification. Officer Miller cleared his throat, a hint of something that might have been suppressed amusement in his eyes. Well, ma'am, he said, addressing Mrs. Albright, this certainly puts a new perspective on things, doesn't it? Officer Ramirez, to his credit, maintained his professional poker face, but I could see the corner of his mouth twitching. So, Mr. Henderson, Officer Miller continued, turning back to me, given this development, how would you like to proceed? Honestly, officers, I said, I think Mrs. Albright and I have a lot to discuss, but perhaps not with law enforcement present. I believe this is now firmly a civil matter, and perhaps a landlord-tenant matter. As far as today goes, I'd just like to get back to painting my fence, on my property, without further harassment. Mrs. Albright made a small, choking sound. She looked utterly defeated. The fight was gone, replaced by a dawning awareness of just how badly she had overplayed her hand. Her campaign against my gate, her petty tyranny as HOA president, had just crashed headlong into the inconvenient reality that her landlord was the very man she'd been tormenting. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had performed a complete, spectacular somersault. Officer Miller nodded. Seems reasonable. Ma'am, he said to the now utterly deflated Eleanor Albright, I'd suggest this is a dispute best resolved privately. We don't see any criminal offense here. Mr. Henderson is within his rights on his own property. He gave her a pointed look. And perhaps it would be wise to be more considerate in your future interactions, especially considering the circumstances. Mrs. Albright could only nod dumbly, her face still pale. She looked like she wanted the earth to swallow her whole. The officers gave me a curt nod, got back in their patrol car, and drove away, leaving me on my side of the gate, and a thoroughly humbled Eleanor Albright standing amidst the wreckage of her authority on the public sidewalk. For a long moment after the police car disappeared, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the chirping of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower from somewhere deeper in the preserve. Finally, Mrs. Albright seemed to find some vestige of her voice, though it was thin and shaky. Mr. Henderson. She began, then stopped, apparently unsure what to say. Gone was the imperious HOA president, in her place was a rather pathetic-looking woman who suddenly seemed very small. I waited, saying nothing. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. She had created this mess, she could navigate her way out of it, or try to. I had no idea, she finally managed, her gaze fixed on the ground. That the property. No, I said calmly. I imagine you didn't. I picked up my paintbrush again. The silence stretched. I could feel her discomfort radiating across the few feet that separated us. The gate, my sturdy, rustic, eyesore of a gate, stood proudly between us, a silent testament to the morning's events. I almost patted it. Look, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, about the gate, and the notices. Perhaps I was overzealous. That was one word for it. Perhaps, I agreed, still not looking at her, dabbing paint onto the fence. Mr. Henderson, she tried again, a note of desperation creeping in. My lease, you mentioned it was up for renewal. That's correct, I said, turning to look at her fully. Starkweather Property Management will be in touch regarding that in due course. They handle all tenant communications and decisions based on my overall investment strategy and, of course, tenant conduct. The implication was clear. Her conduct was now very much under review. Her eyes widened slightly. The full weight of her predicament seemed to be settling upon her. Harassing your landlord, especially when you're also abusing an HOA position, is generally not a good strategy for lease renewal. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. What could she say? An apology now would sound hollow, self-serving. Any attempt to justify her actions would only dig her deeper. She was, to put it mildly, stuck. After another agonizingly long silence, she mumbled something that might have been, "I see," picked up her fallen clipboard with a trembling hand, and practically scuttled back to her white SUV. She didn't look at me as she got in and drove away, much faster than her usual leisurely patrol speed. I watched her go, a profound sense of satisfaction washing over me. It wasn't just about winning a petty squabble, it was about seeing someone who had abused their perceived power so arrogantly be brought face to face with the real-world consequences of their actions. The rest of that Saturday was remarkably peaceful. I finished painting my fence, the new white gleaming in the afternoon sun. The gate stood sentinel, unmolested. No more drive-bys, no more glares. It was as if a malignant presence had been lifted from the neighborhood. The following Monday, I called Mr. Starkweather at Starkweather Property Management. "Tom," he said, his voice cheerful, "good to hear from you. Everything all right with Serenity Acres?" "Serenity Acres is fine, David," I replied. "Actually, I was calling about one of the rentals. 123 Primrose Path." "The Albrights, yes," he said. "Lease renewal coming up in, let's see, about 2.5 months. Model tenants, as I recall. Rent always on time. No complaints from them, no complaints about them. Were you thinking of an increase, or just standard renewal?" "Actually, David," I said, "I'm thinking of non-renewal." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh. Any particular reason? Is there something I missed in the file?" "You could say there's been a recent development regarding Mrs. Albright's community involvement. It's become clear she's not quite the model neighbor I'd prefer representing one of my properties. Let's just say her interpersonal skills in a position of local authority leave a great deal to be desired, and it's created a rather uncomfortable situation." I briefly outlined Eleanor Albright's campaign of harassment against me, her abuse of her HOA position, and the confrontation that had led to the police being called, culminating in the reveal. Starkweather listened patiently. When I was done, there was a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he said. "The HOA president, you say? Harassing her own landlord? You can't make this stuff up, Tom. Apparently, you can live it," I said dryly. "So, yes, I'd like to proceed with a non-renewal notice. Give her the standard 60 days, or whatever the lease requires. And perhaps you could also discreetly inquire with the other HOA board members at the preserve. I have a feeling Mrs. Albright's leadership style might not be universally popular, especially if they knew she was using her position to settle personal vendettas, and against her own landlord, no less." "Consider it done," Starkweather said, a note of professional enjoyment in his voice. He clearly relished this kind of thing more than I did. "I'll draft the non-renewal. And I have a contact on the preserve's board, a reasonable fellow. I'll have a quiet word." The non-renewal notice went out a few days later. I didn't hear directly from Eleanor Albright, and frankly, I didn't expect to. What could she say? But the atmosphere around the preserve at Whispering Pines underwent a subtle but definite change. Her white SUV was noticeably absent from its usual patrol routes past my gate. The stream of HOA violation notices regarding my dilapidated structure ceased entirely. It was as if a switch had been flipped. About a month later, I heard through the local grapevine, small towns and their peripheries are like that Eleanor Albright had resigned from her position as HOA president, citing personal reasons. Shortly after that, a moving truck was spotted outside 123 Primrose Path. I never saw her again. The new tenants at 123 Primrose Path, procured by Starkweather, were a young couple with a friendly dog and absolutely no interest in HOA politics beyond paying their dues on time. My gate at Serenity Acres stood undisturbed, its weathered oak and black iron a testament to resilience and the simple right to be left alone on one's own land. Sometimes, when I pass through it, I still get a chuckle thinking about that Saturday morning, the sputtering rage, the dawning horror, and the sweet, sweet taste of poetic justice. It just goes to show, you should always be careful who you pick a fight with over a gate. You never know who might hold the lease on your meticulously manicured life. And sometimes, the most satisfying victories aren't about grand battles, but about the quiet reclaiming of peace, one slammed gate, and one non-renewed lease, at a time. The air at Serenity Acres felt cleaner, the quiet more profound. The lesson, if there was one, was that bullies, no matter how officious or self-important, often crumble when confronted with a reality that doesn't bend to their will. And my gate. It's still there, perfectly rustic, perfectly mine, a silent guardian once more.